Good morning, Josh.
Good morning, Sid.
Are you, like most of us here right now, battling with fall leaves taking over the driveways?
Well, I live in New York City, so we don't have driveways and we don't have, most of us don't have front yards, and some of us have backyards, but I'm not among them. But we do have a lot of parks, and those parks definitely generate a lot of leaves. And so we are um, battling with them isn't the right word. We're collecting them. And I think over the last few years, we've decided we don't just throw leaves away, we're actually recycling them. So most of the leaves in New York are being composted, as which is starting to happen in cities, not starting, it's happening in many cities around the country.
Yeah, and I don't understand why municipalities they keep collecting leaves. Just leave them out there for the kids to play with and to jump in it. And for sure for the soil as well to thrive from those leaves.
Well, I certainly remember fondly jumping into leaf piles when I was a kid and lived in areas where we collected leaves. And of course, you had to rake the leaves up to put them in the pile, and that was part of the fun. Was you did all that work, and then you actually had something that you could play with. Um, I think that the cities, and places that have more concrete than soil, are have to do something a little differently. And fortunately, as I just mentioned, places like New York, they're taking composting and returning the organic material back into the public grounds pretty seriously. They're doing it with leaf waste. They're now increasingly returning to recycling food. They're now collecting organic waste from people's daily lives and composting those. And they're starting to return back to systems that were well organized and well integrated decades and decades ago, of which we systematically unraveled on this notion of hiding it and wasting it was kind of better than reusing it. And we're finally, at least on the edges, learning that that was not necessarily the wisest decision we could have made.
Yeah, yeah. So the UN climate conference COP30 is happening right now in Brazil. Are you following the noise?
Some degree I'm following. I have a lot of mixed feelings about the COP process in general, but I'm definitely following it.
Yeah. There is so much irony this year. On one hand, we're talking about protecting nature. On the other, they just cut down 100,000 trees in the Amazon to build an 8-mile, 4-lane highway for access to the summit. Indigenous communities are staging protests, calling it greenwashing, and honestly, it's hard to disagree with them. As someone who's worked and cared deeply about native communities and ecosystems, what's your take, Josh, on where these global climate events are heading?
Well, I think there's a lot of facets to that conversation. And just to start with the building an 8-lane highway to gain access to a summit concept, I think that highlights one of the problems between this idea that large meetings are themselves beneficial, that they help, that infrastructure like roads are inevitably a good thing, and that you have to create systems by which building involves creating jobs, involves creating economic activity. That economic activity is ipso facto a good thing, against the conversation that the indigenous peoples of Brazil are trying to have, which is no, it's not such a good thing necessarily. That we need to rethink what growth means and what it doesn't really make sense to put a global conference in a city where you have to build giant roads and concrete and steel and tear down forests in order simply to have that conference. That's more ego than activity, than actual benefit. And so, from my perspective, just again staying with this narrow focus, it tells me two things. One is that maybe this wasn't the right city for this conference. That if you want to have
Right,
this kind of a conference, put it in a city where you don't need to build infrastructure.
right.
Brazil has several cities that could qualify without having to build new roads, more than several. It's a wonderful advanced nation. It's got many access to many things. People They actually had a COP at Rio. That's how I believe the whole COP process started. So why essentially reinvent that wheel? Spreading the wealth in this case is not spreading the wealth. It's spreading something other than wealth. And the other possibility is maybe rethink the conference into a way that if you want to have it in Belém, think about what Belém has to offer and structure your conference so that it can actually work within the infrastructure that exists in Belém. That might mean smaller, less internationally globalized events. It might mean not asking rich and powerful people who need a red carpet everywhere they go. Meanwhile, as you mentioned, the hundreds of tribal nations in the Amazon are feeling like, who's talking for us? Why are we feel kind of left out of this conversation. If you're really interested in the environment, why aren't you protecting, essentially the lungs of the planet, which are the tropical forests that still remain, and Brazil being the Amazon being the largest? And why isn't that job one? Why is job one to make all these important people look and sound important? So I think that's...
Yeah. And that's exactly, Josh, what I wanted to dig into today. The gap between promises and delivery is wider than ever. So how do we stop preaching climate tech and start building systems that actually work? And that's what we're going to talk about it. So let's get into it. The following is a conversation with Joshua Harrison, ecological designer, systems thinker, and co-founder of Leaf Island. This is Pre-Zero Sports Talk podcast, and I'm your host, Sid Bansala. Today, we explore how cities can regenerate, not just sustain, and why nature might still be our most powerful infrastructure. To support our show, please check the episode description. Josh, welcome to the show. It's always a pleasure.
I said, great to be here.
You've said before that we don't need to rebuild cities from scratch. We just need to layer nature back in. The idea has stuck with me.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that the most important way the planet cools itself is through the evapotranspiration of water, either off the ocean or on land through plants, primarily through photosynthesis. That's the way the planet cools itself. We can't patent that, so we have a lot of other solutions that we like to do, but we should really recognize that the oldest technology we have for cooling the planet, for removing CO2 from the atmosphere, for basically stabilizing the wild peaks and changes and destructive elements, is basically the power of photosynthesis, which is at least 400 million years old. So it's been able to be tested in all kinds of situations, in all kinds of places. Its primary example that we think of is trees. Trees do a lot of things in addition to cooling through the evaporation of water through their leaves. They store carbon in vast amounts. They help, obviously, purify the air. They provide all kinds of shade. And basically, there's a great deal of evidence now for something that we all know intuitively. Being outside in a well-cared-for landscape provides all kinds of emotional, psychic, and social benefits, in addition to all of the more formal benefits that we sort of need to tell ourselves are important in order to judge that something is valuable.
You've spent decades visiting St. Bart's, running one of the oldest Caribbean film festivals. What have you observed about ambition?
That's a big, big question. I think I was fortunate enough to sort of fall into a situation where I was able to bring film to an island that had no movie theaters, that was small and had once been quite desperately poor and isolated, but had become quite a center of tourism of a certain kind. And in that process, and over the last 30 years, I've watched and experienced that island evolve in all kinds of ways. But one of the most, well, I guess let me start by saying this. The Caribbean is a fascinating, incredibly important place to think about from cultural development because it's the intersection of Western colonial processes in all kinds of small islands, which allow them to be sort of laboratories of different kinds of responses. And it's a comment, so it's an area that shares a huge common culture in that most of the indigenous people were murdered. They were annihilated first by the Spanish and then later by the English and the French and the Portuguese, whatever took over. And then they were replaced, the populations were replaced by human bondage, by slave labor imported largely from Africa. So you have this, and largely from sort of northwest, from an area in Africa, obviously nearest to the Caribbean. So that meant you had this entire landscape of a geography where you have all these different places that had a sort of a common origin, but were separated by the eventual of the colonial powers that ended up ruling them politically. So the French islands were French-speaking largely. The British islands were British-speaking. The Spanish islands spoke Spanish. And literature traveled a little bit. Music, of course, traveled quite a bit because that was the one language that the slave owners didn't curtail. They really didn't like education. They were so there was very limited access to literacy among the slave populations as Europe understood it. But obviously people find their own ways to communicate and find their own ways to send culture and find their own lives. And music became transcendently important in the Caribbean. So that travel. And you see everywhere from New Orleans and blues and jazz all the way down to samba and Beguine and calypso all come from sort of a common origin, which the great composer Ernesto Lecuona called the collision between African rhythm and European harmony in one way, in one form or another. So you have, but one thing that didn't travel was film. Because film it's a language-based art now that it's talking, even though it did not start that way. And so we had an opportunity on this island that didn't have a formal theater, that was wealthy enough and had enough interest in cinema that there was a public that was there to be able to bring film to that island. And we've been able to stay sensibly connected to that process. And our idea for film was it was another vehicle of bringing people back together culturally. So our focus was Caribbean culture and film.
Right.
One of the things we discovered, to get back to your original question, was that the first stories that people told and the stories that they really needed to tell were stories of exile and stories of slavery.
Yeah.
And the story of exile on an island like St. Bart's is a lived experience, because being that St. Bart's ended up as a French colony, it had a little Swedish segue that's quite interesting, but we can talk about it at some point. But it followed French.
The Swedish segue, you mean that island was offered to the Swedes?
Yes.
Upon Swedes' request.
Right. King Carl Gustaf at the time asked his cousin, and it's around the 1750s, was there some part, because Sweden felt left out of the sugar, rum, oil, the money game that was happening in the Caribbean. Denmark got into it, but Sweden wasn't. So I think they felt a need to join, and they begged. He requested, I don't want to say begged, he requested from his cousin a property. Oh, you have so much.
A gift.
Give me a gift.
Special gift, yeah.
And so this was the island that came up because it was from the France's point of view. It had no permanent source of water. It was small. It was barely surviving as a subsistence island. it was kind of the least economically viable piece of real estate he could honorably gift to Sweden without, and that Sweden would accept. So that's what happened. So it spent 100 years as a Swedish territory. The Swedes built a harbor. They garrisoned 5,000 soldiers of an island that maybe had 500 habitants. They tried to keep it going for 100 years, and in the end, they gave up and gave it back to France.
Yeah.
And where it ended up in, splendid destitution until sometime in the 60s, Lawrence Rockefeller sailed over from one of the islands he had already had a big house on and said, this is kind of a cool place. And then it became known on the tourist map. But as a French island, and as a population of maybe 5,000 people, now maybe 7,500 permanent residents, it didn't qualify for having a high school.
Mm.
Too small for us. So that in order to, while every child was required to go to school, and they were required at least to get through the age of 16 before they could leave, those last few years had to be somewhere else. And so that instantly created this island where young people left. Young people knew they were leaving. They might go nearby. They might go to one of the other historically, they would go to Guadeloupe, one of the other larger French islands. But now, of course, they go possibly to Guadeloupe, but more commonly some go to France, some go to the United States, some go to Canada. And then what happens when they come back? Well, then they go to college. If they're from a certain middle class and above, then that's not on the island either. So by the time they actually finish their education, they've spent half their lives somewhere else, maybe more.
Maybe more, yeah.
And that has a profound effect on the culture of the island, because how does it bring people back other than through the tourist industry? And so that story writ large is the story of bright people from the colonies everywhere. The colonies are essentially kept deprived of having a rich cultural heritage of their own. That happens in the center. And so if you're bright and ambitious, you end up having to leave your home in order to gain the skills and the education that you desire. And then do you bring it back? How does that all happen? So that's a big story. It's a big story in the Caribbean. It's a big story in any colonized place. And it's a big story in a big country too, because it's not so different if you're, living in the middle heartlands of the United States in a small farm town and you want to get educated, you go to one of the big cities, Chicago, LA, New York. I mean, it's a story. So that, of course, is one of the big stories that people told. Music was another big story people told, and obviously slavery and how various responses to slavery, both documentary and fiction, were very important. And until those stories get told well and thoroughly, it's very hard to find creative space for more casual stories.
And on that, Josh, sorry to cut you, because we're talking about displacement and we're talking about exile, which is common with those small islands or former colonies. But we see now in major countries this kind of exodus, if I may say, for whatever reason, economical reason, environmental reason, And it's a big topic. It's a hot topic here in Europe. Immigration. It's a hot topic in the US. And honestly speaking, I don't see how this issue is gonna get better for whatever reason, either economical reason or environmental reason. This issue it will not calm down.
I don't think it will. I think most people who look at it seriously think that climate forced, climate influenced, climate driven migration is not going to stop until obviously we have a better handle on climate. So there, and one of the strongest selfish reasons that the North, the global North, should be taking climate seriously is to actually have a stable population shift. or stabilize some of those great population shifts. Because, of course, here's the sorry truth is that 90% of the population in the world has no responsibility or accountability forever for what's going on with the climate world.
Mm.
They're not generating the CO2. They're not extracting the resources, although they may be engaged in being paid to or subject to resource extraction. But almost all of that is taken over by a very small number of countries, Europe, North America, Canada, and China, to some degree now India, being largest consumers of the resources and largest outputters and emitters of the climate, the greenhouse gases and other issues, not only greenhouse gases that are causing climate disruption. So there's a fundamental imbalance there that unless the global North, takes that truly seriously, is going to overwhelm any systems that we have. So another reason that it's kind of one of the reasons that they hold the COP conferences in various parts of the global South as a nod to the fact that those voices should be heard. I think going back to your earlier notice of the irony, those voices are heard, but not very loudly. And so, but I think that, and as we can see in the United States, in terrible moment, and in Europe in varying degrees that are not quite as awful and still pretty harsh, that the fear of refugees, the fear of outsiders is driving an awful lot of really destructive politics. The idea that people from the southern border would be invading the United States has driven the United States into a politics where we have masked men presuming to have the color of law going into schools and ripping teachers out of classrooms with no explanation whatsoever. There was some trivial conversation that somehow these people were criminals, but in fact, let's just be clear, it is not a crime to be in the United States without documentation. It is a civil offense like a parking ticket. It is not a crime of any kind, and yet we act as if, or we don't. We have a government that's acting as if it's a crime, and that's driven by fear of the other.
Yeah, but then if I use the situation in Europe right now, where everyone is fed up and pissed off and angry, lack of accountability, lack of taking responsibility from the leaders in terms of guaranteeing the basic things that every citizen want, which is safety and security, And since 2015, it's just... it's getting worse and worse, and you cannot blame citizens that work very hard and pay taxes, and their safety it's not guaranteed, And of course,
okay, I'm sorry. That's true in Europe. It's not true in the United States. Our cities were safe and remain safe. They've manufactured fear. This is, this is the Reichstag fire. The United States is not having, we were not subject to, we didn't take in 1 million Syrians. We didn't take in huge immigrant inflows. So we're acting as if those things were true because we have a leadership that's telling us that. So I just want to clarify, we're behaving as the very legitimate conversation you're having in Europe, which Europe has to face, were actually happening. But in the United States, it's entirely manufactured from the current administration. And that's a really important point. The cities in the United States are safer than they've ever been. The problem is economic. There's a big economic problem of dislocation and of extreme wealth, where most of the income that's being generated by the vast improvements in productivity have been taken by the very top, not even the 1%, but the 1/10 of 1% of the 1%. That's real. invading, foreign individuals invading our country in terrible notions for which we must respond is invented in order to protect the conversation from dealing with wealth inequality here. I don't want to expand it out else places, but that said, I think the issue of climate migration and immigration is a terrifically important one
It is.
and how we deal with it. And I only want to observe that Europe, prior to the end of World War II, and actually for a few years after, was probably the continent that had the most population shifts, forced and unforced. So and then we had this 50-year peace, which is 2.5 generations, and enough to forget just how much flux and disruption was going on the continent of Europe for hundreds of years, not just the 20th century. But it's remarkable how easily 2 or 3 generations of quiet remove us from the historical understandings of where we were.
Maybe even before, starting from the World War One, and then back to back, these 2 major events created and the loss of life, Josh.
Right. Horrible.
How did your path shift from media to systems design?
That's a good question. I think I've always been interested in storytelling about how to get to a better and more equitable place on the planet. And some of that's the politics of the world we live in. But increasingly, I've understood you can't maintain a good politics without having a better relationship with the planet as a whole. That really, if we want to believe in any kind of long-term strategy for human well-being, that has to be thinking about how we live in a reciprocal with the planet we're in, and how do we communicate that, and how do we find ways to implement that in small ways, medium ways, and large ways, both at the very local scale, in the middle where you're interacting, and then at the larger global policy scale. And so, from an early age I was working in several fields kind of simultaneously. I was working in media in order to help learn how to communicate. I was actually doing environmental projects, large and small. I happened to found a group called Students for Solar Energy when I was in college, in a place which had a lot of sunshine but no interest in solar energy, and we were in what was then known as a energy crisis. And I just happened to fortuitously ask the right people the right question, and ended up being able to fund the first alternative energy fair in Southern California, which brought a tremendous amount of interest and engagement through this to my university, which up till that point had sort of pretended that physics was really important, but solar energy had nothing to do with anything, even though they were in maybe the most ideal climate in the United States to be interested in solar energy. And later, I spent some time in community development, working on various kinds of projects that brought natural systems back into balance with the communities and helped communities engage with their own and outdoors. And I think you talked earlier about what do we do with leaves? Well, lots of places forgot that we used to compost leaves, and they forgot that when they started to spend a lot of energy paying money and time and resources putting these leaves into hiding them, putting them into dumps and putting them somewhere away. And to the extent we can rebuild those connections and say, wait, those leaves actually are beneficial right here. And they can actually help us, and they're part of the cycles that build and engage our societies, the better off we are. And then that became a conversation about how do we build that conversation more fully into our understanding and our world. And eventually those two processes came together. And I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family of people who did this kind of thing professionally. And then as they grew older, I ended up taking on the responsibility of running a center that my parents had developed called the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure,
Really?
which essentially looks at these issues. And
Right.
that's where this sort of combining of the various threads of my life came together.
Mhm. And do you still think like a storyteller when designing climate systems?
Well, I think at the core, you have to start with why are we doing anything? What's the value of what we're doing? And I think we as a society, everything we do comes from the way we explain it. And there's the great linguist and sociologist George Lakoff wrote a book called Don't Speak of an Elephant. What happens when you say that? Of course, immediately you're thinking about an elephant. Um, so, and we do a lot. I think a lot about about the framing that we supply, the narrative frames that we use to set the system up. One of those narrative frames I alluded to earlier, which is that if we can't make money out of it, if we can't measure it, it's not very important. Well, that's stated baldly. That's, everything we know tells us, from biblical statements like what profiteth a man if he gain the entire planet but loses
Mhm.
his soul. I mean, we know that's not true, but yet we act as
We
if
do.
all of those statements we do. Right. These fables like Aesop's fables, the goose that laid the golden egg, that's thousands of years old. King Midas's touch. King Midas lived before the common era. What, notions of the story of the grasshopper and the ant. These are all really powerful messages that we don't fully integrate. And so part of what my work is to sort of nudge people into thinking differently about the basic ways they value life. What is it that we value? Because if we value the world we live in, we behave differently. And so how do we do what we value? So if we value living in a landscape that has lots of outdoors and where people, we have to first say that we do that. And secondly, we can enact it. We have to believe that this is an important mission for us, as opposed to, wouldn't that be nice if? And maybe it'll happen when, and only the privileged get. Those are all ways to avoid accountability and responsibility
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
making it happen. So that's part of it. But let me get very concrete. One of the biggest challenges we have is this notion of infrastructure. What is a city? A city is a bunch of steel and concrete, and in modern cities, a bunch of steel and concrete and maybe wood, all of which requires energy, labor, and time, and all of which eventually needs to be replaced, repaired, rebuilt.
Mhm.
And the scales on which we do that vary widely. And so all of those, in the way we think about it economically, are depreciating assets. And we have an economic system that in the United States and in many Western countries has something parallel, where you can actually get paid through the system on the value of the money you've lost. And as you can take off the depreciating costs off your taxes, you can use it as a business expense. But what if we thought about things as appreciating assets? What if we thought about things that actually made more money, got more valuable, got more complex and sophisticated over time? And that's what natural systems do. So if you think about ecologically informed infrastructure, like a forest, like a garden, as you tend them, they get stronger, they get healthier. They have to be tended, of course. It's not entirely a passive. Then there are plenty of arguments for leaving
Yeah.
areas wild, but we don't live in a world, we have too many people for that to be the entire story. That's a piece of the story. There's a lot of the world that isn't going to be wild, that's engaged, where we are actively engaged in it, as is every species alive. There isn't a species on the planet from a single celled bacteria or even smaller to the most complex forms of mammalian life that doesn't interact with the world around it.
Mm.
So we do too. The question is, do we do it wisely? do it well? Do we do it in ways that allow our children and our grandchildren to thrive, or do we do it stupidly and selfishly and short-sightedly that allow us to think in 3-month increments? And if we've successfully managed a 3-month increment, we pat ourselves on the back about how good we are and how smart we are. Again, that's a story we tell ourselves. What's
Yeah.
important? Is it important that we act as if our children and our grandchildren deserve the same life that we live? Or do we act as if the only thing that matters is whether I live in this immediate short-term moment the best possible life according to the way I define it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. GaiaSoil turns recycled styrofoam into a green roof. What sparked that idea?
Well, that was sort of a collision of a number of different things that came together, some of which we've been sort of talking about. My colleague and mad genius friend, Paul Mankiewicz, who invented GaiaSoil, was himself is a biologist and a botanist and a man of many talents, and a former student of a woman named Lynn Margulis, who's one of the great American biologists, and who in turn worked with co-founded with Havelock the Gaia theory of the planet as a self-regulating system. So Paul had a direct linkage intellectually, morally, scientifically to this notion of we need to be dealing with reciprocating systems in everything we do. He also lived in New York and realized that that 80% of the buildings that we have are existing buildings, and that many of those buildings were not built with the idea that they could actually should have green roofs. They were built as sort of concrete structures, or steel and masonry structures. So he wanted to find some way to bring all these things together. He needed to find a lightweight material that was light, so you could build a soil, because regular dirt is heavy, water is heavy. You add water and dirt together, a lot of weight, and then you put plants on top of that. There's a relatively limited amount of the roofing in a city like New York with an existing built environment where the roofs are capable of bearing that kind of weight easily without substantial reengineering.
Right.
So therefore, how do we find a lightweight basis for soil? And then, of course, at the same time, styrofoam was an obvious thing to experiment with because it's 30% more of our landfills. It's one of these things that it's one of the most pernicious waste products we have. And again, this is part of the problem, is that waste is an entirely human concept. Nature doesn't have an idea of waste. Every output is an input. And he said, well, what if we could turn this output, styrofoam, into an input, into an artificial soil? And styrofoam has many virtues.
Yeah.
All of the things that make it a difficult product to deal with once you've taken its initial use. It's lightweight, which means it has a lot of volume. It doesn't compress, which means it doesn't shrink down. It doesn't degrade under normal circumstances, and it's very stable. So all of those things mean that in a soil where you coat it so it doesn't actually have any exposure to sunlight, so it doesn't have the few things that do degrade it, it's not exposed to toxic esters and ketols and other volatile chemicals that might degrade the polystyrene. And it allows you, it's not compressible, which turns out to be a real benefit in a soil, because one of the big challenges of any soil over time is compacting. So it doesn't crush. So therefore, and it also allows you to engineer all kinds of air spaces, which then in turn allow you to capture water, allow you to let the microbes feed each other, allow nutrient flows to go to sort of progress very effectively. So you end up with a soil that's maybe 50% more bioactive and bioproductive than a traditional soil. Not as much as hydroponics, but then with hydroponics, you have a whole infrastructure.
Yeah.
With hydroponics, you need to have, you need absolute protection from it needs to be in clean spaces, needs to be protected from contamination of all kinds. It needs to be monitored in all kinds of ways on a regular basis. It needs a certain amount of technology in order to succeed. And of course, water is heavy. So, but with GaiaSoil, you have all of the normal attributes of soil. That is, it's that's sterile or not sterile. And that the styrofoam itself is sealed off. It does not enter the root systems of plants, so it's not involved in any kind of contamination of the food products. And yet, at the same time, in a fully loaded amount of GaiaSoil, say a square foot, and I'll use a square foot because that's the measurement we use in the States, of GaiaSoil, roughly 4 to 6 inches, which is enough to supply the energy and nutrients for a 6 to 8 inch or higher plant growth, which is the complexity of plant life you need to get the full benefits of bringing green surface. With that all alone weighs less than 25 pounds per square foot, when the standard roof in the United States is, by code, has to support a minimum of 30 pounds a square foot. Yeah. So suddenly you're building a tool that does many things. It takes material from the waste stream and turns it into an active product. It allows you to put an artificial soil, but that acts very much like a traditional soil, in all kinds of building morphologies that don't normally accept them. Yeah. And that benefit says that then you can start doing something. You can actually approach the coverage of a city like New York, which was once all forested. And if you can bring enough of leafy green material on the roofs, walls, streetscapes that approach the amount of forestry and forest cover, although this is not tree, it doesn't have to be forest, any leafy green material, that's the volume, that's the amount that was covering the island when the Europeans sailed up, when Henry Hudson sailed up the river that's now named after him in 10. You can then change the ambient temperatures. You can reduce the ambient temperatures to what it would be if you didn't have the buildings there. And you can do that because you have these lightweight soils and substitutes, without removing the building. So you can and that actually changes the local climate, the local ecology of a place in a positive way. And that in turn deals with the two or three biggest problems, environmental problems, that cities have. One is the increasing heat effect, the heat island effect, which is the largest new cause of death in many cities around the world. Yeah. And so this radically addresses the heat island effect. It actually sucks in a lot of carbon, and even more importantly, for areas that are economically challenged, and for poor areas, it plants particles. It's these very tiny sub 2.5 micron pollution, the dust particles that cause most of the asthmatic conditions. Again, asthma is one of artificially induced, climate-induced asthma is one of the most significant health issues in American cities. They adhere to plants. And then when rains come, they drop off and go into the soil, where they get rendered inert. So you're solving a big air pollution problem, a big heat problem, and you're maintaining water all at the same time. So this makes the whole concept of bringing a lightweight soil, reusing existing waste materials, bringing it into building morphologies, into something that, as it scales, can actually positively affect the environment of a city like New York or many other cities. Yeah.
And on that, Josh, on that, just for our listeners, just to have a clear idea. So you explain beautifully that cities are turning into heat traps, and you explain we are using more steel, concrete, glass, wood, and you explain as well that a green roof can help and fight that. And is it measurable? Can you give us an idea?
It's very measurable. And of course, like anything, that numbers vary, but from a from a particularly building owner's point of view, you can save uh, up to 25 to 30% on both heating and cooling. You save it on, you're stabilizing your rooftop conditions, allows you to reduce the amount of air conditioning that you need and reduce the amount of heating that you have, partly because in the summer, the the leaf island effect is in full flower, the evapotranspiration and through shade. And in the wintertime, you actually have an improved insulation on your roof because the styrofoam, because it holds air, actually acts as a very powerful insulator. And both of those in turn reduce the amount of heat stress on a roof, expansion and contraction, which is in addition, and they reduce the amount of direct sunlight. So, ultraviolet radiation, and heat stress, expansion and contraction under heat, are two of the major factors that cause roofs to fail. So you're reducing those impacts as well as all the other impacts. So from a particular building owner's point of view, you're gaining some serious economic benefit. From a community's point of view, you're getting measurable heat effects as much as 10 or 15 degrees on the street Fahrenheit.
Right.
So on street level cooling in areas, and then of course that's a herd immunity effect. That's very local for one building, but as you start to get 30 to 40% coverage, that then becomes a community effect. And that's what the goals are here. It's not the goal for any green infrastructure is to move away from being an evidence of somebody's moral virtue, a virtuous statement that says, I believe in this and I'm there, to where it becomes integrated into normal infrastructure. It's cheap enough, it's expansible enough, it's extendable enough so that it becomes widely used, because that's when the benefits happen. The benefits on an individual building benefit the building owner. The benefits, once you start to have community absorption, they benefit the entire community.
Yeah, yeah. Under Mayor Bloomberg, New York City started painting roofs white to reflect heat. What's your take on that strategy, Josh?
I think it's the cheap fix because you get a certain degree of cooling because you're reflecting light off, but you're actually reflecting the heat back into the environment as opposed to reducing it. But you do get some measurable benefits. But what you don't get are the carbon benefits, the air pollution benefits, the long-term benefits. You get, it's a quick fix. It's cheaper in the short term, but I don't think it is a long-term fix. There are selective areas where painting things white and we're using more reflective surfaces make a lot of sense. There's no reason that a toolkit is only one tool. I think that's another piece where we need to move a little bit away from. There's also, we have to find the perfect solution for everything. No, the perfect solution for everything is a grab bag of different solutions that work better and worse in different contexts. So there's a space for white. So I just don't think it's the answer for everything. And I think it's easily overused because its upfront costs are cheap. And therefore we must do it, as opposed to thinking more strategically about what will actually be long-term, provide better long-term benefits.
So, green versus white roofs. If you were planning a city today, Josh, how would you integrate both, or maybe scrap one?
I think we have to start thinking about a toolkit that has lots of tools in it, and that we need to find the appropriate use for the appropriate tool, which isn't always obvious up front, and is part of that is the natural improvisation that systems and self-regulating systems have. So I think green roofs have a place to play, but they can't fit everywhere. Painting things white so they reflect heat has a place to play. Structural placement of buildings has a place to play. I mean, all of these things come through. I think, though, if you'll look at where cities are moving, and I think the two best examples are both in Asia, both Singapore probably being the richest example of what a green city could look like. And China being the most prolific example where they're throwing out, green cities every couple of years that fit 4 or 5 million people. I think it's just hard to even fathom how much they're doing, even as China, of course, is also the largest consumer of coal and the largest greenhouse emitter in some ways, although they have just actually changed. They've just, reached a point where they're tipping in the other direction. The United States, of course, is not. So we are the black sheep, as it were, in every element of this conversation. So the so I think that, China and Singapore provide models for what green cities can look like if you have the opportunity to build new. I think we have much of the building stock in the United States and in Europe is not going anywhere. So we really have to think about not just what we would do if we have a blank slate, which is important, of course, but what do we do with what's already here, with our existing stock? And there, among other things, just to be clear, the inherent carbon of reusing an existing building almost always is less. It's embedded. You've already paid for it. That carbon's already been accounted for. And a new building, you're creating new carbon debt. So it's almost always, from a carbon point of view, a better option to rethink what you can do with existing buildings. Not always. There's plenty of reasons for that where that doesn't fully hold. But in general, you want to be looking at ways to improve your existing building stock. And by that, we want the existing building stock to have better connections with natural systems in all kinds of ways, better ways it holds water, better ways it generates, oxygen versus CO2, better ways it makes people feel better to live there. More healthful environments make everybody happy. Working with plants is one of the ways there. It's not the only way there, but it's one of the ways there.
Yeah. Well, it's quite obvious there is so many great ideas out there, but one key component, it's the leadership, the decision makers, leaders with the right mindset. You've seen, Josh, the rise of nature-based climate solutions firsthand. When you watch COP30 unfold, how do you feel about where we are?
I think we're in a mixed place. That I think, for example, the laws of nature as giving natural rights to both living creatures and to the lived environment, the external environment, that's progressed more rapidly than I had feared it would. And it's reached a level where it's starting to have certain kinds of impact. I think that the deep reliance on fossil fuels, which is in part supported by the wealthiest companies and individuals on the planet, influence isn't going away. They're just looking, instead of that leadership saying, okay, it's inevitable that we're going to have to change the way we do things, so let's be in front of it. They're still doing everything they can to hinder the larger decision-making policies that would help survivability for the billions of people who are not owners of fossil fuel companies and or that elite. So I think that's a mix. I mean, I do think the answers really, you started earlier, from a leadership point of view, have to come from below. The leaders at the top aren't doing it. The United States had a very significant leader named Al Gore, who was vice president of the country, who really understood and still understands the climate issues. Yet, if you look very pragmatically at what that position allowed him to do, well, it allowed him to go to Rio for the first COP1 and allowed him to say we should do something, but it didn't allow him to create any binding rules for the United States. Right. And if the United States had no binding rules, why should anybody else? And that policy has continued. So it's not a leadership it's got to come from below. It's got to come from, as we talked a little earlier, about the values of the people at large, of the citizenry at large, to sort of demand better leadership from their leaders. That's the whole point of a democratic process. You know, there are countries with technocratic top-down economies, like I had mentioned earlier, Singapore and China in different ways. They're well-trained, scientifically minded people who don't have to worry about that much about what the communities have to say, can make reasonably rational decisions. And we're seeing them understand that the rational decision is to build green. Okay. What we're not seeing that same conversation in the West anywhere near to the same degree, although I would argue France requiring all new buildings to have green roofs and or solar panels or both is a pretty important step. I would argue that Germany figuring out how to reduce its regulatory roadblocks to incorporating home solar. So you now have 35, 40, 50% solar penetration in the home market. I'd say that's a pretty good marker of ways forward that are driven down from the existing leadership, not even the new leadership we need. And I suspect that one can find individual examples of that pretty easily throughout Europe. Holland has quite a few examples of trying to turn a circular economy in. But you'd also find major counterexamples where people are acting against that policy. But where you will find a great consistency of interest is in the youngest people. And that's, I think, that's where the energy is. I mean, let me just give you a wonderful Swedish example. Look at what Greta could do sitting by herself on the steps of Parliament because she didn't know what else to do with a sign.
Yeah.
And that kind of power is waiting to be unleashed by lots of people. There are many tens of hundreds of thousands of people following what she's doing quite closely. There are hundreds of thousands of people on their own, individually, all over the world who understand that they've been dealt a really bad hand economically. They've been dealt a really bad hand ecologically. And those two can't be solved in vacuums. They have to be solved together.
But then the same youngsters, and here you're mentioning Greta, we like her or we hate her. She tried to do her very best at that age to basically boost the awareness within the urgent issue that we are dealing with and we're going to deal with for maybe years to come. But in the same time, those youngsters, they are fed up with the empty promises and pledges within the UN climate conference. And there is a growing criticism that these summits have become performative and have become almost obsolete, talking about all those leaders using their private jets, traveling from point A to point B. So in one hand, we're trying to address a problem, and in the same time, we're trying to suggest solutions. And there is plenty of solutions, and we try as well through that to give some kind of hope. But then if you want to lead, you lead by example.
Yeah. I think the hypocrisy is very real, and I do think the COP system has basically run its course. I don't think we started this by noting how Berlin is not a great city for what it was, and it required a significant distortions of the natural landscape in order to create the moment for significant distortions of the political landscape. So I think that's an evident sign that this is not the board, and we need to rethink that. And I think one of the ways to rethink that is distributed meetings. But that's tied to, I think, the larger failure of international global institutions that's going on right now, that were set up just exactly in the aftermath of World War II to sort of create a way to regulate social problems, political problems, and economic problems. And the last 5 years have really shown us that that system is no longer functioning very well. And so we're going to have to create different systems that function better, just like the UN was a response to the failure of the League of Nations to actually be meaningful. And the UN, as it now functions with a Security Council of permanent members who have permanent vetoes, isn't going to be the solution for climate. Just as giving oil companies the same voice as citizens
Yeah.
is not going to end up with a result. So one thing I will say is that part of the power that people have is the pretense among people that this is important. As another phrase I find useful here is hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. In other words, and as long as people claim this is what they want, then you have some leverage against them by showing them how far they are.
Yeah.
And what we've found, of course, in the United States is we currently have a leadership that's impervious to shame. They don't actually care. It's not the right approach for them. So I think that's the lesson that young people are learning, that shame-based, guilt-based processes aren't strong enough at this point to mold decisions. Direct action is, whether that's withdrawing from society, whether that's rebuilding independent processes, whether that's politically taking over leadership, which is presumably what a democratic process is supposed to give us. But they're all going to, it's all of the above. We are not in a great place, I agree. But I think that I'm driven by, again, I think we may have talked about this before. I'm driven, by a observation of Antonio Gramsci some decades ago in a similar situation politically, although not ecologically, which was, as he said, the old world is dying and the new world is yet to be born. We're in a time of monsters, and we are indefinitely in a time of monsters. And his response was his wonderful phrase: you may have pessimism of the intellect, but you need optimism of the will, which is to say, the only way forward is forward. The only way we can move is to continue to do the things we know are the right things to do in our hearts and in our souls and in our understanding of the planet, and to bring as many people along with us as we can. And that's, again, why I think that young people are the key, because they understand intuitively that things are broken. They're not trying to overcome this brainwashing that tells us everything's wonderful. And that's the power that collective action can give us if we can take advantage of it.
Yeah, yeah. In 2021, post-pandemics, I had so much time, and I ended up purchasing this book from Bill Gates, How to Avoid the Climate Disaster. And 2 weeks ago, he made a U-turn. So, and I was so disappointed, Josh, really disappointed, because I had the pleasure to read the book, and I have so many
Right,
notes,
I see that.
And I was really disappointed, and I was scratching my head. I said, what on earth did happen? Maybe his next book, the title should be How to Walk Back a Climate Disaster. So what's your take?
I think Bill Gates is a very smart guy, but I think he's tied to a kind of solution set that involves identifying problems, solving the problems, and then moving on to the next one. It's kind of a linear solution set that does not actually think very clearly about the climate. And I think he recognized, and also, frankly, his greatest success has not been about climate. His greatest success has been in disease and public health. And his climate solutions have always teetered on the edge of geoengineering and figuring out big technological fixes that if only we all adopted the way he wants us to adopt, problem solved. And I think he reached the realization that that wasn't going to work, and that he was going to focus on short-term issues that he thought were more productive. He's a little more subtle than the U-turn, but it's clear that once he stated that I'm not all in on climate over the long term, most people are going to interpret that exactly as you did, and rightly so.
Yeah.
So I think that Bill Gates is an example of the limitations of the Western technological economic model to solving complex systems-oriented problems. Doesn't have, it's much too mechanistic. It's much too, let me call it, results-oriented,
Mm.
evidence-based. It doesn't leave room for improvisation. It doesn't leave room for complexity. It doesn't leave room for a lot of things that climate systems and solutions are going to need to be able to have. And it doesn't leave room for him not making a lot of money.
You're listening to the Pre-Zero Sports Talk. For more conversations on sports leadership, faith, performance, and innovation from Sweden to the world, visit prezerosportstalk.com. Yeah, yeah.
And,
I
and
mean,
those are all pieces of it. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. We were talking earlier about hope and about the younger generation to basically have a different, put it this way, positive output. If things are taken seriously, if there is accountability, if everyone comes together, especially we've seen that that breakthrough during the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, and then things have fallen apart, you know, and then. When you see something, look, I have nothing against Bill Gates, you know, but you can't treat this issue of climate change and nature like a piece of software, you know. Yes, there is no silver bullet, there is no quick fix. It's a long-term commitment as long as we are serious, honest about the issue first, you know. Either we believe climate change and global warming is the consequence of human activity and prosperity or not. But at the end of the day, we all champion, we all care that we need to have clean air, clean water, and clean soil, and protect and save and conserve the beauty that nature has, from forest to the Amazon. We were talking about it earlier. Uh, yeah, which is crazy. Josh, we are running slightly late in terms of time, but in the next 10 years, what gives you hope and what does a living city looks like to you?
Well, I think what really gives me hope is that people are increasingly tuned in to the fact that we need to make significant changes in the way we live our lives and the way we engage with the planet as a whole. I think that there are many examples of that. I think one of the things that um, really is, I think, missing is that we don't understand enough about what else is going on. We don't have,
Mm.
part of our anxiety is that the problems are immense and they're difficult, they're complex. And we get the feeling that we're not here, that if we don't know about something, it's not happening. And yet, all around the world, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, large, small, you know, there are individual nations, entire nations like Bhutan and increasingly Nepal that are already carbon neutral. You know, there are other countries that are increasingly moving into that space. And we don't spend enough time understanding that these are all, to some degree, interlocking answers and solutions. Let me give you an example, not in the forest space, but I'm not in the city space, but in the forest space. When I started working on forest issues, which is another of my concerns in California because of the fires and lots of challenges, the entire state government thought that the only answers to the problems of fire were, you know, to suppress it. We had to get rid of it. We had to put it out. That otherwise we were okay, and that they didn't quite understand why a lot of trees were dying, and they didn't understand why there was drought going on. But it was really, that was not really important. Now, less than 10 years later, the entire state government understands that California, and I'll speak specifically about California, is is a landscape that's a fire adapted landscape. The fires are integral to the health and well-being of the landscape, that the native people who came in quantity, the indigenous people came in quantities when the ice ages receded and the current forests grew, understood that. They learned how to work with fire, and they learned how to use fire productively to help spread kinds of plants and food for materials used for medicinal and for sacred use. And now the state recognizes that strategically. And it's not acting completely in that way, but it's moved almost 180 degrees. That's the fourth largest economy in the world. It's not a trivial thing for California to make that change. It's not a trivial thing for California to start speaking rhetorically as if native and indigenous practices are improved. Now we can hold them, that virtue, the homage that virtue plays, that vice pays to virtue, we can hold them to their own accountability. They have now made it clear that every elementary school in the state of California has to talk about lived on that land before that school was built. Okay, now you have an opportunity. You're building a groundswell for systemic change in the way we understand how we're doing. So that's one of the things that gives me hope, that that these things are not immutable, that we don't live in a permanent moment where we are, and that our biggest obstacles is that we have a relatively small number of extremely wealthy and powerful companies and individuals who find it very, very hard to see that they could still be wealthy, they could still be comfortable, they could still live good lives if they let the rest of us live good lives too.
Yeah. And on that, Joshua Harrison, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Before we close, I want to leave our listeners with a quote from Wangari Maathai, the late Kenyan environmentalist and Nobel Peace Prize winner. You cannot protect the environment unless you empower people, you inform them, and you help them understand that these resources are their own. And it's important to remember these resources are not just shared, they are holy. They belong to every living creature. They carry memory, healing, and wisdom, passed through seasons, not systems. And if we keep losing them, we lose more than trees. We lose truth. There is a verse in the Bible that speaks directly to this responsibility. Genesis 2:15 says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." It's a reminder that from the beginning we were asked to be the custodians, to care, to protect, and to preserve what was entrusted to us. Thank you for listening to the Pre-Zero Sports Talk. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep building forward. We want to thank you for joining our show. If you enjoyed this episode, we have more for you. You can now watch the entire episode on our YouTube and Spotify channels. While you're here, subscribe and don't forget to tap the bell. Visit prezerosportstalk.com to explore more conversations on sports, leadership, faith, performance, and innovation. From Sweden to the world. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and make a difference. We'll see you soon. Take care.